It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Warner Lewis here, of course, from the flight deck, and that, of course, means some more Smart Talk Radio is in your future. In this segment, we're going to be talking about a big subject indeed, climate change, the status, and ultimately its impact on the world in which we live. We're going to be talking with Dr. Robert Coates. He is a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Cal Davis. He has over 40 years experience, focusing on a wide variety of environmental issues and land management, and in particular on aquatic ecosystems. He also has long-term research interest focused on nitrogen cycling and biogeochemistry at the watershed level. We will talk to him about that and its relationship to climate change. He has a PhD in wildland. My gosh, I'm messing this one up. Wildland Resource Science from the University of California as well. We are talking also about a conference that is going on is in the process, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Peru that happened this month. Dr. Professor Coates, how are you, my friend? I kind of botched that one up, but how are you?
Oh, I'm fine. You did just fine with that introduction.
Okay, well, good. Let's do this. Let's give you a little bit better setup here. If you would, share with our audience a little bit more about specifically the work that you do and why climate change and that entire subject is so important to you.
Well, I've been working for many years in the Tahoe Basin, around Lake Tahoe, and looking at the impacts of both water quality and climate change on the lake itself and on the watershed and on the hydrologic cycle there. My interest in climate change and its impacts on the lake goes back to about 2002. I went to a science conference at the lake, and I heard a climate scientist talk about the impacts of climate change in the Sierra, and he said that this is not just something that's out in the future, that we can look at the data and we can see the impacts now. And then on a break at the conference, I looked out across the lake, and I thought, well, if he's right, then we'll see that signal in the deep water of Lake Tahoe, because the great thermal mass of the lake will filter out the short-term variations in temperature, and we'll see a very clear trend over time. So I got the temperature data for 400-meter depth in the lake and plotted it up, and sure enough, the result was just clear as day. So then I dug a little deeper into it and looked at the effects on thermal stability of the warming trend in the lake and related that to changes in climate. I've also been looking at, more recently, at the changes in nutrient loading to the lake that have occurred over time, and that's kind of an interesting part of the story. We're still kind of figuring out why we're seeing time trends in that. But we can talk about specifically about the climate impacts on the lake and on the hydrologic cycle.
I'm curious as to, I just wanted to jump in here real quickly, and that is, you're a scientist. Is there from just an objective, from where you sit, is there any division in the scientific community? I know scientific community is a big, broad term, but let's just say amongst the scientists that you work with, particularly in your discipline, that climate change is, in fact, having a very real and I would assume negative effect on our environment, or is there some genuine disagreement?
No, there is no genuine disagreement on the major outlines of what we call the anthropogenic warming, greenhouse warming paradigm. I was just at the conference of the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco, and there's an overwhelming number of posters and oral sessions relating to climate change and its causes and impacts. Among climate scientists, especially at the PhD level, I've seen estimates that 97% really agree with the basic outlines of the global warming paradigm. So no, there is no other viewpoint. I got a Christmas letter recently from a friend who had gone to a conference sponsored by the Heartland Institute in Las Vegas, purportedly to present the other point of view. And the Heartland Institute, as you may know, is heavily funded by the petroleum industry, and they try to promote the idea that there is doubt and uncertainty. Now, there are, of course, interesting scientific questions, such as the role of aerosols in the atmosphere and how they form, the specific relationship between global warming and the magnitude and frequency of tornadoes. These are things climatologists are chewing over, but the main outlines that global warming is happening, that is caused primarily by greenhouse gas emissions emitted by human activity, and that the consequences by the end of the century, if we continue on the present path, will be somewhere between severe and catastrophic. There is virtually complete agreement on those things.
What about, and again, we're not pointing a finger here. That's not what we're trying to do here in terms of, because we understand that this affects everybody that is on the planet. But is there a particular, I know the United States was considered the really, really bad guy for a long, long time. Or do we still lead as being the villain here? Or what about also our friends over in China or in Europe or Asia? Tell us about that.
Well, that's a very important point. Chinese emissions have been increasing greatly as they've grown their economy. A lot of that is coming from burning of coal, and they're bringing new coal-fired plants online all the time. On a per capita basis, we're still way ahead of China in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. But in absolute amounts, they, as I understand it, have now pulled somewhat ahead of us. So really any solution has to involve China, as well as India and Brazil, and, of course, the other developed nations. So, I don't think there are any villains or good guys in this issue. The argument of the developing countries is that, well, you guys in the developed world have prospered by burning lots of fossil fuel and producing lots of greenhouse gases. You've caused most of the problem. Now you expect us to cut back on our emissions and to tighten our belts. That's not fair, and I think they certainly have a point. On the other hand, a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, and it doesn't matter where it comes from.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Robert Coates. He is a scientist and visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California at Davis, over 40 years of experience in the environmental field. We're also talking specifically because of the recent UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It has issued a most alarming wake-up call to date. It found man-made climate disruption is real. It is happening now and affecting everybody on the planet. That's what Mr. Coates has been talking about with us. What do you see? Again, we ask guests this a lot of times. If you were able to wave a magic wand, if you were able to do the Coates policy, what would be the first 2 or 3 steps that you would? What do you want to see happen right away?
Well, the way I would approach the problem, and the way many economists would like to see the problem approached, would be to implement a tax on carbon, on fossil carbon. That could be implemented at the wellhead for wells or at the mine mouth, and imposed per ton of carbon released that's going to be released into the atmosphere. That would drive a higher price for fossil carbon, and that would work its way through the economy. It would mean probably higher prices for people who get electricity from coal-fired plants. But it would have an almost immediate effect in switching consumers from the carbon-intensive technologies to the alternative technologies like wind and solar. It would mean some kind of a tariff on imports from countries like China if they did not go along with a similar program and begin reducing emissions. The other approach that is being used is cap and trade, And that may work out to some extent, but there's an awful lot of ways of gaming the system. And I'm just concerned that it is really not going to do the job. So that would be the approach that I would like. Now, a tax on carbon should also have with it a rebate of the money taken in to consumers. Basically, everyone with a Social Security number gets a check at the end of the month or the end of the year, based not on how much carbon they have used, but on their share of the total revenues taken in by the tax. That's sometimes called fee and rebate, just because people don't like the idea of a tax. But a tax is what it would be, and let's be blunt about that.
Share with us, with our listeners, if you would, a little bit about Climate Voices, that community of scientists. Tell us what that's all about and the work that you all do.
Well, I don't know a great deal about it, except the contacts I've had with some radio interviews like this one. I've looked at a list of some of the other scientists involved, and a couple of names I recognize, and very highly qualified and well-known. One of them is Kevin Trenberth, a world-class climatologist. Another is Catherine Hayhoe, who lives in Lubbock, Texas, who's been very outspoken on climate issues. She's a PhD-level climatologist. She's also an evangelical Christian. And she has said, I think it's really worth repeating, that when people ask her if she believes in climate change, she says, "No, I don't believe in climate change. Belief is for things you cannot see." But she can see the effects of climate change. She can see the data, and she knows that it's real.
What do you, again, the UN conference, this whole intergovernmental panel on climate change, tell us, is this an annual event? Tell us about its origins and what are they attempting to do there and what really, in essence, comes out of it?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's a panel under the United Nations which has been producing a report every 5 years documenting the causes and effects of climate change. The other is the Conference of Parties, and that's the meeting that just recently ended in Lima, Peru. This was the COP20, it was called. And that is an outgrowth, I think, of the Kyoto Protocol that was an earlier attempt to limit greenhouse gases. It has a relationship, I guess, to the IPCC, but it runs a little bit independently. Now, there's been a lot of frustration with the COP meetings, and there was one in Denmark a few years ago that concluded with pretty much doing nothing, and really people just threw their hands up in the air. The one in Lima, Peru, has generated a little more interest, largely because of the agreement between China and the U.S. to reduce emissions significantly. The problem, of course, is it's very fine for China and the U.S. to agree on cutting emissions, but the question is, how are we going to do it? What's the path to doing this? Are we going to eliminate the subsidies for fossil fuels in the U.S.? Are we going to put some kind of a cost on fossil fuel emissions so that the costs of the emissions will be internalized in the economy? What exactly is the path? And that has yet to be spelled out. Now that the Republicans have taken control of both the Senate and the House, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to pass any new legislation on climate change. But certainly Obama can do quite a lot of things with his presidential authority, and I'm hoping he will.
Do you believe overall, let's just take the last decade as a time period to look back on, is private business, whether it's in the United States or around the world, is it becoming more responsive to this, or do you still think they're turning the other way?
Well, I think it depends a lot on which business you look at. There are some businesses, large corporations. I think General Electric has made some strong statements about climate change. Even Shell Oil sometimes has shown signals that they understand there's a problem. Other corporations have continued to deny that it's happening and have continued to fund the climate change deniers through groups like the Heartland Institute. Some of the big oil companies are in that bag, and some of them have talked out of both sides of their mouths. There are a lot of other businesses that are, of course, strongly committed. Those are the ones that have involvements and investments in alternative energy sources such as wind or solar or geothermal. And then there are a lot of businesses, retailers who understand they need to make their buildings more energy efficient. It's just a very mixed bag, I would say.
What about scientific research? Again, it's very obvious at this point you believe there is no question. There's all kinds of evidence that the climate is not only changing but continuing to head in a very, very negative direction. Is there? I hate to say, is there need for more research? But it sounds to me like you've arrived at a point where you don't need to see anymore. What are we learning from the new things that are happening?
Well, I wouldn't say we don't need more research. As a scientist, of course, it's always nice to see funds directed toward research. But there are some questions that are really important. One of them is the technology of carbon capture and sequestration, which means basically pumping CO2, capturing the CO2 from fossil fuel consumption and pumping it back into the ground. A lot of questions about the technology of how to do that. There are some important issues in some of the linkages between regional climate and the global climate change. For example, we've noticed in the last couple of years that the jet stream gets locked into a peculiar pattern of very deep meanders, very large amplitude of its waves, and that has allowed the outbreak of polar air into continental U.S. during the winter and creating very cold weather in the East Coast. There are questions about how is that linked to the melting of the Arctic sea ice, or is it linked to the increased warming of the tropical Western Pacific? And climate scientists are not in complete agreement about what those linkages are. So there's some very interesting questions in issues of climate change and linkages between regional and global climate. In my own work, I've been involved with looking at the impacts of climate change on Lake Tahoe. Some of your readers, no doubt, or your listeners have no doubt come out to California and seen the beautiful Lake Tahoe. It's a very large lake, deep blue color and great water clarity. And that's the lake I've been working on and documenting the impacts of climate change. Now, one of the things that we are afraid is going to happen as the lake warms is that it becomes more thermally stable. That is, it takes more and more wind energy to mix the lake to the bottom. It's that deep mixing that occurs about 1 year in 4 that regenerates the oxygen to the bottom of the lake. That, of course, is important for the trout and the other organisms, crayfish that live on the bottom. And as the stability of the lake increases, it takes more and more wind energy to mix it, and that deep mixing and rejuvenation of the oxygen will eventually shut down as the stability increases. That will cause a increase or the reduction of iron from ferric to ferrous, that is +3 to +2, and that would cause a release of soluble phosphorus into the water column, which will stimulate algae growth. So the big question that we're wondering about is how long is this going to take? Part of that is what is the effect of climate change on the wind? If the effect is greater than we think, if there will be actually a decrease in the winds, then the shutdown will occur sooner. If winds continue and even increase due to big storms, then maybe the shutdown won't occur so soon. So those are the kinds of questions. Now, just to make it clear about the effect of wind and temperature on the thermal stability, maybe that's not immediately obvious. But any of your listeners, I'm sure, have swum in lakes in Kansas during the springtime. They've noticed warm water near the surface. You stick your foot down a little bit deeper or dive down, the water is much colder. That's because of this thermal stratification, and it takes wind to break that up in the fall. And the warmer the lake, the more wind it takes because of the physical relationship between the density of the water and the temperature. I don't want to get too much into this, but it's just a simple physical phenomenon.
Well, it is a gigantic subject. It's a fire starter, but it is one that is certainly has all of our attention. We've been talking again with Robert Coates. He is a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. We're also talking in the relationship of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, held recently in Peru. And Dr. Coates, as we wind down here, how can our listeners find out more about your work and this entire issue?
Well, for my work, they could go to the UC Davis website of the Tahoe Environmental Research Center, TERC, T-E-R-C. They can probably find that online by Googling it. They could Google my name and Tahoe, and probably some papers will pop up. My last name is spelled C-O-A-T-S. That'll be easy enough to find. Or they could email me, and I can send them reprints. My email address is Coates, C-O-A-T-S, at hydroikos.com, and it's spelled HYDROIKOS.com. And information on climate change is very easy to find online. I mean, there are huge numbers of sites, realclimate.org, skepticalscience.org. The American Geophysical Union has a good website. Lots and lots of material. Now, of course, the climate change deniers are there making a lot of noise, and you have to kind of think about the source of what you're reading.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us, your opinions, and again, thanks so much for spending part of your day with us today, and have a great 2015.
Okay, well, same to you and your listeners.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.